New figures this week show inflation still running at 2.7% year over year, far outpacing wage growth. And while President Trump might now be getting the affordability message, his latest idea is to join Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in calling for the federal government to cap interest rates on credit cards.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the WSJ's editorial pages, columnists Kim Strassel and Alicia Finley. Inflation is still not whipped. That's the message of a pair of reports out of the Labor Department on Tuesday, the first being the Consumer Price Index from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The headline figure showing prices up 2.7% year over year, still stuck well above the Fed's target of 2%, despite President Trump's periodic barrages toward Chair Jay Powell to lower interest rates. Alicia, you've looked at this inflation report. What do you take away from it?
Well, as you say, inflation still isn't whipped at 2.7%. Inflation really isn't increasing per se. Prices are increasing, but the inflation isn't increasing, the rate of change in price increases. But it also isn't falling. It's essentially been flat over the last 12 or so months. Now, I think the problem, or one of the problems for Trump, is that many of the categories where you're seeing the biggest rises or increases in prices are also the categories of goods and services that people tend to spend more on. And I would include shelter, that increased by 0.4% in the last month, medical care, also 0.4%, food, 0.7%, and energy bills, which is natural gas and electricity. And that was a 1% increase. And those also tend to be the categories where you've seen the biggest increase over the 12-month span as well. Now, there are a lot of reasons, policy reasons, that are contributing to some of these price increases, but it doesn't mitigate against the fact that Americans are actually feeling quite acutely the inflation pain. And Trump, I think, he says, well, affordability is a hoax. And maybe Democrats, no doubt, are trying to exploit the increase in prices while downplaying it under Joe Biden when inflation was much hotter. But prices continue to go up. At the same time, wages are not necessarily increasing faster than prices. Now, in the first 5 months, or January to May, real wages, and that's post-inflation wages, wages increased by 0.7%, but you've actually seen it basically flatlined since then. And that's in part because inflation really picked up over the summer. And again, you could debate the reasons why. It's possible that his tariffs in some goods, his tariffs produce increased prices in some goods. But as long as Americans aren't feeling that their wages are keeping up or are exceeding inflation, they're going to continue to be in a pretty down mood.
The food category is also what really jumps out to me in this inflation report. Year over year, food overall up 3.1%. Food at home, 2.4% year over year. Food away from home, 4.1%. And as Alicia says, in December alone, an increase of 0.7%. So it is not your imagination if you are having some sticker shock at the restaurants or the grocery stores. Also, some analysts suggesting that you can see tariff effects in some of these categories, potentially, furniture and bedding up 3.6% year over year. And as a reminder, tariffs are generally not thought to add to the overall price level, the generic inflation, but they can raise prices on these individual goods and feed through to some of these products that are on store shelves and then to the broader categories that the BLS tracks. Kim, that is the basic of the affordability problem as it is now being discussed in politics.
Yeah, and just a few more numbers on this, touching on what you and Alicia said. I think the real problem here is that the places where we're actually seeing inflation biting the most are areas where lower and middle income Americans in particular spend a larger share of their paychecks. So you mentioned food, medical care, Energy bills, electricity and gas bills are up 7.7% over the year. Household insurance climbed 8.2%. So these are things that you can't go without, right? It's not as if you decide that things are a little tight and you're not going to go to Disneyland. You got to pay for your rent. You have to pay for your heat. You need to have food on the table. And so these are necessities. And every time people are going to the grocery store or opening those bills, saying how much their heating was for the month, they're getting a real painful shock, and it's leading to a bad mood. But I think that this is further reason why Donald Trump ought to be worried a lot more about inflation than he is about the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy. I mean, all he's doing is beating on the Fed constantly because he'd like to see housing prices go down. He wants to say interest rates are falling. He wants this to feed into the continued growth in the market, et cetera. Wall Street loves it when rates get cut. But the Fed is not hitting its 2% inflation target. Inflation is not getting whipped. More monetary easing of the type that the president wants is not going to help in that venture at all. So while it goes against the president's inclinations, probably the best thing he could actually be doing for himself right now is to sit still and sit quiet on the Fed, let it do its best job, even if that means not lowering rates in the lower term, and then focus on broad-based policies rather than some of the ones we're going to talk about here, which seem also to be enormously counterproductive.
Well, I am starting to wonder whether he's gotten the message that this inflation problem, the affordability problem, however you want to frame it, whatever term you want to put on it, is a political issue for him and Republicans in these coming midterms. Unfortunately, he seems to be responding to it with pages out of the sort of populist left Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders playbook. We discussed on a previous episode his call to ban institutional investors, big companies, from buying single family homes and using them as rentals. Let's talk today about the recent call now to put a cap on the interest rate on consumer credit cards. This is President Trump on Sunday floating the idea to reporters on Air Force One.
I want a cap on credit card interest rates because, some of them are 28, almost 30%. And that the people don't know they're paying 30%. The people out there, they're working and they have no idea that they're paying 30%. No way. We're putting a 1-year cap at 10%. And that's it. They know it. They've really abused the public. The credit card companies have totally abused it. I'm not going to let it happen.
And here's Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson responding to this idea on Tuesday.
One of the things that the president probably had not thought through, and others at first glance, it sounds great. We should bring down, interest rates to 10%. It would help everybody, all borrowers. There's a lot of Americans who have a lot of credit card debt. But then, what some of the experts have said is, well, but the problem is if you do that, then the credit card companies, the negative secondary effect is that they would just stop lending money, and maybe they cap what people are able to borrow at a very low amount, and then that would have a negative effect on a lot of people who work on revolving credit.
Alicia, Speaker Johnson seeming to try to be a little bit nice to the leader of his party there. Maybe you can be more straightforward than him, but what would be the effects of this kind of cap on the credit card market?
Well, I think it would result in a restricted credit for lower income people who tend to have lower credit scores. Now, there's no actual evidence that credit card companies are exploiting consumers. This is kind of a misnomer propagated by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and much of the left. And it's really regrettable that Donald Trump is now also contributing to this populist, pile on against banks and the credit card companies. But the reality is, over the last several years, interest rates on credit cards have increased, along with the benchmark, the Federal Reserve's benchmark interest rate. So in 2021, when Fed interest rates were basically near zero, the average credit card APR, annual percentage rate, was about 19.3%. Now it rose to about 24.9% toward the end of 2024, and has since come down as the Fed has actually cut rates. Now, the other thing that contributes to higher interest rates or for people is higher delinquencies and defaults. And what you've actually been seeing in recent quarters, and actually I'd say this goes back to probably around 2022, is you've seen delinquency rates, especially severe delinquency rates, increase. And now they are actually all the way back to the 2008, 2009 recession levels, if you can believe it. So credit cards have to price in that risk. And if you actually listen to the bank earnings report this last week, they've said that, well, it's not just the lower income people or people who have lower credit who are falling behind on the payments. It's actually some of the people who had higher credit scores. So it's essentially broad based. What would happen if the government capped interest rates at 10%, which is essentially below what any credit card right now offers, is one, you'd see the rewards points that people get, for example, for airlines and all that, go away pretty quickly. And two, you'd see the credit card companies would become very restrictive about who they issue cards to. And you'd probably see some of them try to make up for the lower cap in some ways by increasing fees. They may charge, the American Express charges like $600 or $700 for a card. You might see other cards start charging fees just to actually have a card. And this is actually essentially what you've seen in other contexts when the government has tried to impose caps, whether it be with the Durbin bill or Durbin Amendment and the Dodd-Frank bill, which capped debit card fees or debit card interchange fees. What you actually ended up seeing is that rewards points then went away on debit cards, and then credit card companies started offering more rewards on credit cards. In the payday loan context, what you've seen is a lot of states have tried to cap interest rates that lenders can charge. And as a result, in many of these states, studies have found that lower income consumers lost access to credit. Now, the question is, well, what kind of credit are they going to have then? Now, if you cap interest rates at 10%, and then in many of these states, they can't even get a payday loan, perhaps they could get one of these buy now, pay later services, Affirm, that are being offered by Affirm, Klarna, and some other fintech companies that allow you to make installment payments, for instance, over like 4 or 8 weeks to pay off a purchase of something at no interest. But a lot of these companies also auto draft their borrowers' accounts, which means that these people can get charged an overdraft fee if they don't have enough money in their account at the time, which would just boomerang. So I think there are a lot of unintended consequences that the president hasn't thought through. Nor has the left. It's just a populist idea. Let's cap interest rates, let's impose price controls. And I would remind you that that Kamala Harris, similarly, when she was running for president, she embraced many of these kind of populist ideas of going after companies for price gouging and all of that. But it really is counterproductive.
And it is a price control. It's a price on credit, Kim. And I agree with Alicia. I think there would be all sorts of unintended consequences. There are many people who use credit cards often and pay off their balances, and so they don't owe any interest on that amount. But credit cards are enormously useful as payment networks. And some of those people are getting points or cash back. I think if you capped credit card interest rates, that all would disappear. As Alicia lays out, you might end up paying actually a fee for the use of that credit card, a use of the payment network, because the people who are operating it and maintaining it need to have the revenue to support that and have a profit margin. And if that goes away, they have to make that up somewhere. That's not to say that there are not other people who do not use credit cards carefully and get in trouble with that debt. But it's always a choice. Economics is always a choice of compared to what. And so the option, if it's not to use a credit card, if those people don't have that credit available to them and they need it for some reason, for a car repair or for something like that, if they're living month to month, the alternative option might be a payday loan. It might be a loan shark, or it might be having to go without the car repair that they think they really need. And so, Kim, I'm a little disheartened to see the president, at least, jumping on this bandwagon. He had a call apparently with Elizabeth Warren that went very well. Although encouraging to see other Republicans, including Speaker Mike Johnson, nice to his party leader though he may be, speaking up and saying we need to really look at the economics about this before we sign on to it.
Indeed. I mean, this is Econ 101. Okay. This is basic math. And I actually thought Speaker Johnson, probably because he was being a bit delicate with Donald Trump's feelings, I laughed when he said, well, some experts say, no, like if you have a brain in your head, okay, like all of what is coming is laid out here, okay? Price controls mean one thing. When you institute price controls, you get less of something. Like all of history shows that. We know that that's the case. All of these things that you and Alicia have laid out as unexpected consequences, we can't really call unexpected consequences. They are expected consequences. It is exactly what's going to happen if this is instituted. But I just also wanted to throw out here, just you mentioned you were disheartened by the president. I mean, this is just bad politics. It's annoying in that I actually really resent politicians who transfer blame to companies when the fault for something is entirely government. There's something particularly cynical about that move. And this is a classic example of it. Why are credit card rates higher? Alicia just explained it. We had a boom of spending under Joe Biden. They flooded the economy with money. Inflation soared. The Fed raised interest rates to attempt to deal with it. APRs on credit cards are a reflection to an extent of those rates, and they went up too, just as in, since the Fed has cut rates a little bit, they have come back down. But, you know, if you're mad that your credit card interest rate is high, don't go blaming Citibank. Blame the Democrats who blew the bank from 2020 onward and caused this problem. It's also bad politics because of the risk of the inevitability that it won't work. I mean, and that's just the thing, is you can throw out these gimmicks right and left. It sounds as though you're being responsive to some sort of need that's out there in the public. You end up getting not only do you not get what you're hoping for, people better off, you end up with people worse off. And so you haven't actually fixed the problem. You've laid the blame on the wrong people. You've let government off the hook for its own involvement in the affair, and you end up with a bigger problem than you started with. So I don't know who's advising Donald Trump on these ideas. The last person in the world he should be calling for advice is Elizabeth Warren or AOC or Bernie Sanders, because I would note, if he hadn't paid attention, none of them have been elected president. And that was because a lot of people know the problems with their economic agenda.
Two more things I would raise just about the politics of this, Alicia. I think Kim had a pretty good list there, but it's also strikes me as calling for something that requires Congress, and Congress is not going to do. Your party that is in control of Congress is not going to pass this credit card cap. Trump also was talking about it as a 1-year cap, which is, just boggles the mind what he thinks is then supposed to happen after 1 year. We're going to cap your credit cards until shortly after the midterms, November 2026. And then Congress is just going to let that expire, and the interest rates are going to go from 10% back to where they were. Just imagine the pandemonium, the fight it would be in Congress with Democrats and Elizabeth Warren saying you cannot possibly now uncap credit cards after capping them for a year. It strikes me as not a framing that Republicans want to set up for the early days of 2027.
Right. So a couple of points on that. Yes, I think I would say it would have to be done by Congress, but then you look at what a lot of things that Joe Biden did that didn't have congressional authorization, and he tried to force through by regulation. And I think that's a real risk that Trump tries to do that here. Potentially, he could try to use the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to deem anything over interest rate over 10%. a certain lending product, and therefore has to abide by all kinds of other regulations. And this is what the Biden administration tried to do for overdraft fees, by the way. It could also try to say that, well, maybe it's an abusive or deceptive practice and try to ban it de facto that way. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, under Jonathan McKernan, has actually been rolling back a lot of these Biden price controls and illegal diktats. So it would be really regrettable if now all of a sudden they start using or extra legal authority or illegal authority to impose the same kind of regulations that Biden did. Now, on the short-term measure that he's only calling it for 1 year, I think that just exposes the pure cynicism of this play. He's trying to keep interest rates low for a year to help Republicans maintain control of the House, which is he's very worried about. But the problem is, if you recall, Joe Biden took a lot of other short-term moves to try to quote-unquote improve affordability when inflation was surging. And I would include it in that bucket a lot of things in the housing market, in which they eased credit at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA, and also kind of waived away mortgage payments for some people who weren't paying. And the result actually ended up being higher prices and people kind of staying in homes that they couldn't afford, and which ended up backfiring for all Americans. So that's the problem, I think, with a lot of these short-term, myopic moves, is that they end up backfiring.
Amid these concerns about affordability, Kim, I also wanted to ask you on a more optimistic note about a new study on the middle class. The Journal has an editorial on this under the headline about that disappearing middle class. The study is by a couple of scholars at the American Enterprise Institute. And let me just read a couple sentences from their introduction write-up. Populists on both of the political left and right routinely claim that the middle class has been hollowed out. These claims, to the extent that they are based on evidence, rely on a relative definition of the middle class, such that if income doubles for every family, the middle class does not grow. Then this is their corrective. They say, using an absolute definition of the middle class, we find that the core middle class has shrunk, but only because more families have become upper middle class over time. The upper middle class has boomed from 10% of families in 1979 to 31% in 2024, unquote. And Kim, we'll give you the last word, but I wanted your reaction to that in this broader context, the conversation we often have about the economy, given that these concerns about the hollowing out of the middle class are often what are used to justify the kinds of policies we've been talking about, caps on interest rates and so forth, but also larger industrial policy ambitions on both the left and I think the populist MAGA right.
Yeah, count me as someone, I'm absolutely thrilled by this report. And it's so overdue because I am among those and so bored out of my mind by this false conversation that we're having, which is actually led to people claiming that, the middle class is in crisis, the middle class has collapsed. Both sides, as you know, are using it. The right has been using it in certain instances. It's been among the reasons that the president has tried to justify his tariffs and a handful of other policies. Liberals use it all the time. It's why we have to raise taxes so we can hand more money to the middle class, and we have to redistribute income, and we need more entitlements, free healthcare and free childcare and paid family medical leave, because it's all for the middle class. And this report is really important for a couple of reasons. One is one that you just noted, is that it exposes the ruse of a lot of research about the middle class, and this trick that gets used whereby it's all about how you define the middle class. So even if somebody's earning twice as much as they were last year, they're somehow still just right in the same place where they were, because these studies are constantly moving what the middle of and the middle is in the middle class up or down, depending on how people are succeeding or not succeeding as a whole in the country. If you have a more absolute marker for this, and you base these brackets instead on an income groups on, for instance, multiples of the federal poverty level, and kind of keep it in that place, then you've got a really, really good news story. The story of the past 50 years is this steady progress out of the core middle class and into the upper middle class. The share of families in the core middle classes declined to 30.8% in 2024 from about 35.5% in 1979. But the upper middle class has absolutely boomed, exploded. That bracket now accounts for 31% of families, up from about 10% in 1979. And one of the things that the authors write is, quote, for the first time in American history, more families in 2024 were above the core middle class threshold than were below it. That is just, fantastic news. I would also note that it's kind of what you see when you look around. And it's sort of why a lot of those middle class studies don't really land home for people, because they can see it themselves living better than they did when they were kids growing up, their kids having more later in their teenage years than they had in their younger years. People feel this gradual progress that many folks are making. Not all, okay, and that is something we still need to think about and talk about. But for many, many Americans, the life that they live today is significantly wealthier and one of less stress and economic anxiety than they were in 1979. That is something we should be celebrating.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. And we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.